Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. So we're going to talk about some of the talking points, some of the noise that is out in the environment as it relates to how we can go about being healthier, how what is causing a lot of the non-communicable disease issues based off of the perspectives that are being thrown at us, particularly as it relates to a lot of the food stuff. We've talked about this over the last few podcast episodes, but what we're going to do is we're going to try to kind of hone in on what are some of the key points that are being raised, and more importantly, look at, is it actually fun? Is it actually true? Is the science backing up what is being stated, or is there something else that comes into play when we start looking at this idea about, is the food that we're eating poisoning us? Is the food that we're eating toxic to us? Is the food that we're eating somehow not making us healthy? With this, the kind of the spirit of what we're going to discuss here, while some people may claim that there's a political slant to what's being presented here, we're not being political. And so the whole idea here is to make sure that you're not applying your politics to what's being presented here. We're trying to simply just discuss the science of what's going on as it relates to the non-communicable diseases that seem to be the keynote to, or the fundamental perspective of the current administrative's health perspectives. And so let's talk about some of the tenets that are found within this whole idea about Make America Healthy Again.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
So there's been a lot of talk over the last few decades about how we can go about becoming healthier, how lifestyle is going to impact health. And there's a lot of talk about the impact that our diet has on our overall health. So much so that the US Department of Health and Human Services has a central tenet within their whole agenda of Make America Healthy Again, focused specifically on diet. A tenet that has led to the Secretary of HHS, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to insist that medical schools teach nutrition as part of the core curriculum, as if nutrition, or more importantly, his perspective of nutrition, or even more importantly, the perspective about diet, as a central core foundational element of the curriculum to prospective physicians, to future physicians within the United States. The whole idea there is it's not something new. That position has been held for a number of decades among public health advocates and has been a noted position in terms of point of emphasis for a number of previous surgeon generals within the United States. If this is a move that is done without bias of intent or bias of application, I'm all in favor of it. The problem is that the move is not being done without this bias of intent. The idea here is to teach nutrition, but more importantly, teach dietary ideals, not necessarily teach nutrition, based off of what is being put forth within the various kind of, I guess you best, for lack of a better term, propaganda materials that are being produced by individuals within the MAHA, the Make America Healthy Again movements, with the kind of central tenet ideas to this dietary ideal, kind of falling in line with a lot of the dogmatic practices that we've talked about and that we've written on, that's in the Dogmatic Diets book, that kind of looks at this idea about the impact that processed foods have, the impact that seed oils have, the impact that pesticides and herbicides have on our foods, and the impact that those things have being the root cause for all of the health issues that are currently plaguing the United States and currently plaguing humanity. The problem with that is that there's a perspective that is being presented that is not entirely true. And so when we start looking at the claims being waged, and let's ignore for the moment here the fact that health lies within that continuum of fitness and fatness that we keep discussing, that we have these very complex interaction of various factors that are going to impact metabolism, body composition. Let's ignore that for a second here. When we start looking at the claims that are being provided by, particularly by the MAHA advocates, by the advocates of these tenets, it's really going to kind of behoove us to take a step back and say, okay, are we actually looking at factual information, or are we looking at dietary myths that we have to understand metabolism and that we have to understand nutrition in an attempt to basically dispel those myths? It's very similar to a talk that I gave recently at the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society's annual conference about how professors of anatomy and physiology, professors of health sciences need to look at integrating metabolism with nutrition when teaching metabolism to undergraduate or graduate students studying to become health professionals. Because without that, we're going to fall trapped to a lot of these mythoses that are out there, and the mythoses that kind of perpetuate what's going on within the ideals of these individuals. And so when we start looking at some of the ideals that are being presented, the first kind of tenet that is there is that ultra processed foods is going to be an underpinning kind of factor in making people unhealthy. When we start looking at this idea about processed foods, we have to look at it in terms of the fact that all food is going to lie along a continuum of processing. And because all foods are going to lie along a continuum of processing, we can't state with any veracity of accuracy that any food is not processed. That is one of the things we have to kind of put forward as a caveat that gets kind of missed within the people who are proponents to that central tenet that processed food is the root cause for, or one of the root causes for, the non-communicable disease epidemic or pandemic, depending upon how you want to look at it, that we're currently facing. Here's the problem with that. If we cook foods, that food becomes processed. When we start looking at this idea about processing, there's a need to look at it in terms of what do we mean when we say processed? And we wrote on this in terms of processing, and the proponents for, or the people who follow the dogmatic practice of raw food in terms of their dietary practice, where the idea here is that when we process foods, it's going to somehow lead to a loss of nutrients, a loss of vitamins, a loss of minerals, a loss of micronutrients within the foods that is happening, or it's going to somehow alter naturally occurring proteins, naturally occurring enzymes, that is going to reduce the ability to digest the materials that are being consumed. Or the other idea that's coming into play here in terms of this idea about the processed foods is that refinement of the foods is somehow going to lead to an inflammatory response. That refinement of carbohydrates, sugars, refinement of the fats, the oils, addition of sugars, additions of fats is going to somehow lead to inflammation responses within the body. The principal argument that's being made is that too much of what is being eaten is going to be within the ultra processed category within that continuum, where we have this kind of continuum of unprocessed foods to minimally processed foods to processed ingredients, and then that ultra processed food, where the majority of things that are being eaten based off the proponents to this ideas proponent, or the proponents to this central tenet, is that the majority of the foods that we're eating
fall in that ultra processed category. It is a category of foods that are linked to chronic inflammatory responses, that are linked with the exposure to metabolic disruptors, where those who are in favor of arguing to reduce the processed foods, the argument here, the argument in favor of reducing processed foods, is that the processed foods can lead to health issues. And they tend to cite the additional sugars, the refinement of grains, the refinement of fats, the increase in sodium, the inclusion of artificial preservatives, the artificial or the natural flavor enhancers, the food dyes that are all within the ultra processed foods. If the additives, if the processing leads to chemicals that can act as a metabolic disruptor, chronic exposure to those metabolic disruptors can lead to some of the non-communicable disease issues, some of the issues that can come about that we think about when we start thinking about metabolic diseases, non-communicable diseases, the overfatness issues that come about within that fitness and fatness continuum, where that increased metabolic disruptor is going to lead to increased food intake, which is going to lead to increased metabolic disruptor consumption, which is going to lead to even more food intake, which is going to cause changes in inflammatory signals, which is going to cause changes in leptin and ghrelin and insulin and GLP-1 and glucagon and a whole bunch of other hormone signals, as well as a change in sensitivity to the anabolic hormones within the body that leads to an anabolic dysregulation. That anabolic dysregulation, which is going to lead to abnormal signals coming from the adipocytes, coming from the fat mass, coming from the fat tissues, that leads to hyperadiposity, too much fatness, that leads to dyslipidemia, hypercholesteremia, to changes in blood lipids, changes in blood cholesterol levels, that leads to inflammation signals, that causes changes in the way in which the heart functions, that increases blood pressures, that changes signals for skeletal muscle growth, that changes signals for skeleton growth, that changes the way in which the body is going to respond to glucose regulators, that's going to lead to changes in pancreatic functions, that's going to lead to hyperinsulinemia and hyperglycemia, the two of the kind of signals that we look for when we start looking for what everybody references as diabetic conditions. All of these things is going to lead to that issues of overfatness and metabolic syndrome, all coming from the exposure to potential metabolic disruptors. But the problem is that the metabolic disruptors are not just limited to the processed foods. There are a number of materials that can be eaten that can be considered a metabolic disruptor. This includes the natural, non-nutritive sweeteners that are in vogue right now, that are being used as replacements for sugar, because we now have sugar being the boogeyman in the diets, like we talked about previously. The problem is that a lot of those non-nutritive sweeteners have chemical signals that mimic fructose response within our perception for taste. And that is going to drive us to consume more foods. That's going to lead to a nutrient imbalance. That's going to lead to a gain in fat mass. That gain in fat mass and that nutrient imbalance is going to activate immune cells to cause inflammatory responses. Even if we're not taking all of these additive things that the MAHA people are thinking about, when you start thinking about the ultra processed foods causing disruption, causing the non-communicable diseases to come into play. So we want to make the argument saying, yeah, ultra processed foods should be limited. We want to make that argument, and we're in favor of making that argument. But we have to be very careful to state that the ultra processed foods are the thing and the only thing that is going to come into play as it relates to the dietary issues, even looking at the other central tenets that are found within the Make America Healthy Again ideas as relates to the nutrition side of everything. Because once again, it's not just about nutrition, it's about metabolism, something we'll get to as we go through today's discussion here. So while it's very easy to argue that processing is going to trigger inflammation and inflammation is going to trigger the non-communicable diseases, it's very easy to argue that. It's very easy to argue that processing is the culprit, but it's not processing. It's the nutrients that we see in the food that's the culprit. It's an argument that is counter to the faulty assumption being waged by the advocates to this Make America Healthy Again agenda as relates to teaching about nutrition, but more importantly, teaching about dietary practices to prospective healthcare professionals. The idea that is being presented along that MAHA idea is that non-communicable diseases is associated with eating something that is not seen prior to the introduction of mass-produced foods. Here's the problem. This is where you have to understand history. A lot of the early fad diets that are out there, and we still have some of these early fad diets. For those of you who like to eat yogurt, for those of you who like to eat your breakfast cereals, those all come from very early fad diets. The milk fad diets of England, the Kellogg weight loss fad diets of the late 1800s, early 1900s. If we want to think about this idea about nutritional aspects impacting metabolism and leading to disease issues, we have to take a step back and look at the history of stuff. These issues were seen, and it's not simply because of the fact that we now have all this mass-produced foods. If it was simply because of the mass-produced foods, the Kellogg Brothers cereal company, the Post cereal company, the Quaker Oats cereal company, all of the General Mills products would not be around. The breakfast cereal companies and the grain cereal companies came about in an effort to institute their dogmatic dietary practices to counter what they saw as an unhealthy eating behaviors within the American population. And so that selling point that their diet, and in particular their grain cereals and their grain products, are meant to be a cure for the health issues associated with eating the foods that they saw as being unhealthy, means that we can't look at this just as a processed food issue is the blame. We have to be kind of careful here as well, because there are some food additives that the tenet within this ultra processed food tenet within the Make America Healthy Again agenda for nutrition and teaching about dietary practices makes to wish taboo within the American marketplace. They want to make some of the food additives taboo. They want to outlaw without necessarily outlawing it. Most of this comes about through a faulty assumption of what the FDA's GRAS is indicating. So the FDA principle of GRAS, GRAS, that is the basis for what is sold within the United States. It's different than what we see within Europe. It's different than what we see in other areas within the world. And because it's different here than it is in other areas of the world, the immediate assumption is, well, that must mean that it's unhealthy here and it's more healthy there because we see stuff here. We only see stuff here because we're looking here. That's the only reason why we're seeing stuff here. The same metabolic issues that are happening in the United States are happening other places. It's not something where the United States is a petri dish with no interactions and no interconnectedness with other things or other people or other environments. The generally recognized as safe principle within the FDA is the indication that based off of qualified expert evaluation of the scientific data and the past experiences noted with chemicals impacting human metabolism, there is an indication that some chemicals are able to be added to food products and can safely be added to food products within the United States. There's a different perspective that is taken elsewhere, such as within Europe, where the assumption is that the chemicals are not necessarily granted this recognition, where one set of chemicals may be removed as being harmful within Europe that may not be recognized as harmful in the United States. It's not so that the chemical is harmful, it's not so that the nutrient is harmful, it's how it's being recognized. And it's based off of what is the empirical evidence that is being evaluated. And the idea that, oh, well, the company's going to automatically make it so that it's safe is a logical fallacy. It's an ad hominem attack. And because it's an ad hominem attack, because it's a logical fallacy, everything else that is being argued has to be thrown out because you have a foundational logical fallacy within your argument. There is a set of chemicals that should be removed from foods, and it is currently under a larger amount of scrutiny than has been in the past. And that is the artificial dyes that are being developed from hydrocarbons, petroleum-based chemicals. And that's because there's an increased awareness to the relative risk that these chemicals have to our metabolic functions and the fact that they act as not only a metabolic disruptor, but have carcinogenic effects on the body. And we should applaud the removal of these artificial dyes, even if it doesn't make things look as palatable as it looked in the past, because the colors have changed. But removing something because we now have new evidence or better evidence doesn't mean that we were doing something faulty in the past. This is the science versus the pseudoscience. In science, if I get new information, I have to change my perspective, which means that if I'm being shown something that up until just a little while ago, evidence kept saying it's okay, it's safe, it's okay, it's safe, but then we sit back and look at other evidence, look at new evidence, look at different evidence, do different analysis, where it's no longer gives that same level of safety, that it increases the relative risks, increases the odds ratios for having something abnormal, having something that is mutagenic, having something that's carcinogenic, having something that is metabolic disruptive come into play. I have to change my perspective. I have to change my conclusions. That doesn't mean that the previous conclusion was incorrect. It was correct based off of the evidence that was there at the time. And because it was correct with the evidence that was there at the time, we have to accept it as being correct based off the evidence that was there at the time. It wasn't a blunder. It wasn't something malicious. It was based off of the evidence that was available. And it wasn't done so as to be able to sell stuff. It wasn't done so as to increase market share. If we look at it strictly off of the health science perspective, we have to make the conclusion off of the information that is available at the time. There was a book that I read a few years ago that talked about brilliant blunders from people who we respect within the scientific community. And it keeps going back to, well, Darwin was wrong because Darwin didn't know about this. No, Darwin was right based off of what Darwin knew. Einstein was wrong because Einstein didn't know about this. No, Einstein was right because Einstein knew what Einstein knew at the time. The gaining of information means that we have the ability to change our perspective. And the ability to change our perspective is what we should all want to do. It's the sign of intelligence. And it has to be based off of, what do I know about the topic? And this is where we have to fall back onto who has expertise within that niche. And while we all want to stipulate that we are all experts on our body, which we may well be, we are not experts on all bodies. And that's where we have to utilize the people who have the scientific expertise and the background to make the conclusions based off of what the evidence says. Which takes us to another point that is kind of hinted at and discussed and put forth as it relates to this processed food and the impact that processed foods might have within our metabolism and the issues that can come about as it relates to metabolic diseases and non-communicable diseases, which is the sugars that are being added to the foods. We have had multiple discussions about sugars becoming the boogeyman in terms of dietary issues, in terms of nutritional issues. The idea that most people reference when they start talking about the sugars has to deal with what most people reference as the diabetic conditions, the metabolic conditions that are associated with high blood sugar issues, where a lot of people will fall back on, well, if I cut sugar from my diet, my blood sugar levels drop. And that must mean that extra sugar in my diet is going to cause my hyperglycemia, my high blood sugars. We have a post hoc ergo prepare hoc logical fallacy in that statement. One of the student and I were discussing this idea based off of something that they had heard people talk about in terms of the glycemic index and how the glycemic index is able to help reduce their blood sugar levels. following the diabetic diet references. Yes, I can reduce the blood sugar levels by reducing the amount of sugars that I am consuming. I can also allow a pool to empty by simply doing cannonballs all day long or allowing the sun to evaporate the pool. If I'm not putting water back into the pool is going to empty. If I don't replenish the sugars that are being used during metabolism, I'm going to reduce sugar loads. Everybody needs to have carbohydrates. Everybody needs to have sugars. The idea that we have to watch out for added sugars is it's a misconception. It's a misnomer. The body doesn't recognize whether it's an added sugar or whether it is a non-added sugar because there's no actual scientific labeling that would indicate that it is added or non-added. It's a marketing thing. It's a marketing thing based off of the fact that sugars are now the boogeyman. If we label stuff as having added sugars or non-added sugars or having less added sugars than something else, you're going to go and buy the thing that has less added sugars. You cannot simply reduce all of the issues that are associated with diabetic conditions, associated with the metabolic conditions, strictly off of diet. If you look at the systematic reviews that I've published and the research that we've published as relates to the necessity to have a combination of lifestyle interventions as relates to overfatness issues. You get, due to overfatness, you get a condition of chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation leads to anabolic dysregulation. You get a disruption in how the body is supposed to grow. And because the body's not responding for growth, it's responding for inflammation, you don't get normal metabolic functions. The only way to correct that is through correcting the hormones, correcting the neuroendocrine responses to the body or within the body. And the only way to take care of that is through increased physical activity, specifically organized physical activity, which is called exercise. And it's not the aerobic, quote unquote, cardio, which we've talked about as being the incorrect term. It's not the endurance aerobic exercise that provides the greatest benefit. It's actually the resistance exercise that provides the greatest benefit. There are a number of studies that have just recently come out as relates to exercise and the impact that exercise has on non-communicable diseases. My stuff in terms of metabolic issues, colleagues of mine in terms of cancer risks, other colleagues of mine in terms of neurodegenerative diseases, where we want to lay blame on all of these processed foods as relates to increasing inflammation from the additional sugars, from the refinement of grains and oils, from the extraction of nutrients and the fortification processes that take place, that somehow adding the nutrients back into the food somehow makes the foods less nutritious because nutrients are being added back into the foods. Once again, you can see the fallacy in the argument that's being made there. But all of the research that we have is currently pointing towards, while nutrition has an impact on it, while diet has an impact on it, physical activity has a greater impact on the overall physiological endocrine side of all of the cogwheel actions taking place as it relates to both the overall health issue as well as the body compositional issue, the aesthetic issue that everybody's trying to achieve through changes in diet and exercise, through changes in lifestyle, which is one of the things that comes into play when we start looking at what are the advocacies that are taking place as it relates to particularly this MAHA idea, this Make America Healthy Again, that we have to have this Adonis body image where we have this intrinsic explicit weight bias towards individuals based off of the fact that, oh, they have a BMI that is something. They have a waist-hip ratio that is something. Without understanding the complexity of what's there, we can very easily fall prey to some of the ploys that are being projected and some of the misguidedness that is out there. It's some of that misguided notions that takes us into that kind of that second tenet that is found within the core arguments that's being made from this perspective about nutrition, but more importantly, dietary dogmatic practices that need to be taught. And that's the idea that we need to reduce the use of seed oil in our foods, that we have to promote animal fat, that we need to promote saturated fats, that we need to somehow reduce what is being used for cooking purposes from the seed oils that we see. The premise that is there, the premise in terms of the fats and the oils within the Make America Healthy Again is an antithesis to the long-held assumption that we should be replacing saturated fats, whether those saturated fats are from animal products or from plants, with unsaturated fats, whether they are the monounsaturated fats or the polyunsaturated fats. Within the promotion of trading the seed oils for the saturated fats, from trading the canola oils, the corn oils, the cottonseed oils, the grapeseed oils, the sunflower, and for the olive oils, for the beef tallow, for the lard, for the butter, for the avocado oil, for the coconut oil, that somehow we're making things healthier with that change. It's a premise and a promotion that is counter to the epidemiological research that has been noting for almost 2/3 of a century now that large consumption of particular animal fats without a concurrent consumption of vegetable and seed oil tends to be the root cause for cardiovascular issues: hypertension, atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease. And that's the key part here, is that it's the large consumption of animal fats without also consuming vegetable and seed oil. There has to be a combination of various types of oils within the foods that are being eaten. It's not necessarily the animal fats themselves that are causing issues. It's the incorrect ratios of the fats that are being consumed. And so we have to look at, okay, what is the ratio? What are the ratios that we should be consuming when it relates to the fats that I'm eating? And one of the things that we have to look at when we're looking at this idea is the fact that we need to have about a half of a gram to about two-thirds of a gram of fat per pound of body mass, about 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram of body mass of fat consumed each day. We should be consuming about 20 grams, give or take, of the saturated fats. We should be consuming about 2 to 3 grams combined of the omega-3s. We should be consuming between 12 and 17 grams combined of the omega-6s. The omega-3s are the ALAs, the DHA, the EPAs, the quote-unquote heart-healthy fats. We should be minimizing the amount of trans fats. We should be consuming less than 1.5 grams to 2 grams most at a day of the trans fats. We should also be consuming some of the omega-9 fats. And this is where some of the conversation comes into play. It was like, but I shouldn't be eating that much fat. I should not be eating 0.5 gram per pound. So if I'm a 100-pound person, that means that I should be eating 50 grams of fat a day. If I'm a 200-pound person, I should be eating 100 grams of fat in a day. And everybody thinks, well, if I'm eating all that fat, that means that I'm going to be fat. And that's not the case. Eating fat does not make somebody fat. Eating fat does not cause in itself all of the heart issues, all of the blood vessel issues, the hypertension, the coronary artery disease, the atherosclerosis. None of that is coming strictly from the fats that we're eating. None of it is coming from all of the cholesterol that's in foods that we keep hearing or have heard are bad for us. The idea about needing to make that change has to come from what we're trying to do in terms of the ratios of fat. And this is where we have to have a little bit of wiggle room in terms of agreeing to disagree with the perspective here. Should we be careful about the seed oils that we are using? Yes. And that's because the way in which we store them, the way in which we cook with them, can cause a change in the chemical signature of the molecule, the way in which the molecule is structured, based off of either a response known as oxidation, and that's due to exposure to the sunlight, as well as how long we allow it to sit around, as well as the heat sensitivity of the molecules based off of the cooking temperatures that we use. And this is where the unsaturated fats tend to have oxidation issues, tend to have heat treatment issues at a higher likelihood than we see with the saturated fats. And so there is some credence. So it's important to understand that we have some credence to the arguments being made here on that MAHA advocacy in terms of the dietary restrictions, the dietary discussions that should be taught to the medical students, that should be raised when we discuss stuff with our healthcare professionals. The processing of the seeds for oil and the chemical nature of those oils, particularly the polyunsaturated fats, means that the storage and cooking technique can have an impact on the metabolic effect that the fat has once it's in our body. And That's because the polyunsaturated fats are less stable than the saturated fats, particularly when they're stored for long periods of time. They become peroxidized, they become unstable, they become oxidized, they become a reactive oxidative species when they get exposed to oxygen for long periods of time, when they get cooked at very high temperatures. And because of that, they can lose some of the protectiveness, but quotes around that protectiveness idea, that we attribute the polyunsaturated fats to. That doesn't mean that we should automatically switch out the fats. That doesn't mean that we should automatically switch out the unsaturated fats for the saturated fats. That doesn't mean that we should automatically switch out the seed oils for the saturated animal fats. There is a taste difference that can be perceived. Some people refer to it as the umami characteristics of food based off of use of animal fats relative to the seed or the nut fats or the fruit oils. And that has to deal with the chemical structures and the way in which those chemical structures are being perceived within the mouth. That doesn't mean that it's better for you. It may just simply taste better. One of the things that we have to remember, along with the idea about consuming the various amounts of fats, is that we have specific ratios that we have to remember, particularly when we start looking at those omega-6s and those omega-3s that we've talked about previously. And that's where we want to make sure that we keep a ratio of between 4:1 omega-6s to omega-3s to 6:1 omega-6s to omega-3s in terms of the amounts of fats that are being consumed. Where if we overconsume the omega-6s and underconsume the omega-3s, which can very easily be done based off of the type of oil that we choose to use within the foods, we can very easily disrupt that ratio. And the disruption of that ratio can lead to inflammatory signals coming into play. And this is where the proponents for needing to make that switch to get rid of the seed oils for the saturated fats indicate that, oh, well, if you have all this seed oil, you're going to get joint pain. You're going to get inflammatory responses. You're going to get atherosclerosis. And that has to deal with the omega-6s and the omega-3s having the ability to be precursors for hormones within the body. When we disrupt that ratio, when we increase the ratio towards the omega-6s, and the omega-6s become the higher end in that ratio, we can increase the level of proteins known as complement proteins coming from our inflammatory cells, coming from our immune cells. And that leads to an increase in inflammatory hormones that can, based off of other issues within the body, can lead to increases of arthritic changes within the joints. And that's because arthritis is an inflammatory issue. It's an immune issue. You can also get and see a change in atherosclerosis because, once again, atherosclerosis is an inflammatory issue. It's an immune issue. And people who have overconsumed, and once again, the whole issue here is overconsume the seed oils relative to the other oils that are available, the other fats that are available. We clinically see that the excessive consumption of those seed oils relative to the other fats in the diet lead to increased expression for arthritic pains and for possible atherosclerosis. That doesn't mean that the seed oils themselves or the vegetable oils themselves are going to be the cause for those issues. It has to deal with the imbalance in the ratios. And once again, it goes back to what some of those fats, some of those oils are providing. And it's something that we talked about when we talked about veganism. We talked about vegetarianism within the Dogmatic Diets book, as well as within the YouTube quick take on is being vegan good. And that's because what we can get is we can get excessive amounts of lectins, excessive amounts of oxalates, excessive amounts of phytates, excessive amounts of phytosterols, excessive amounts of tannins, if we have overconsumption of some of the seeds that are used to contribute to the seed oils within our diet. But once again, it doesn't mean that those are the cause for the issues, because it goes back to, am I at my balance point? And that's the key here, the balance point amongst all of the various types of fats. The other thing we have to look at, and goes back to the discussion that I had with the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society's annual conference talk that I gave at the end of May of 2025, is that we keep talking about needing to watch out for how much saturated fat we have in our diet because of issues as it relates to heart disease, as it relates to blood vessel issues. But metabolically, if we look at the the foods that we're eating, the nutrients we're taking in, strictly on an energetic purpose. The energetic purpose fats, the fats that we use as fuel to give our body the energy molecule, the ATP that it needs, are saturated fats. Unsaturated fats do not go into the metabolic pathways that provide us with the energies that we need. When we start looking at the fats within the diet, we start looking at this idea, well, we should go ahead and use the avocado oils, use the palm oils, use the plant-based saturated fats. The body doesn't recognize whether it's a saturated fat from an animal or saturated fat from a plant. Saturated fat is treated as a saturated fat. The cardiovascular changes, the immunological changes that we see don't come about from the fat itself. It comes about from the antigens that are associated with the cell membranes of the things that we're breaking up, that we're packaging during the digestion and absorption processes within the intestines, that then get transported to the liver, that then get processed within the liver to make the VLDLs, the LDLs, and the HDLs that we talk about in terms of blood cholesterols that are associated with all of the heart and cardiovascular issues that we talk about in terms of the saturated fats. It's not the saturated fats, it's all of the other markers that are associated with those circulating levels of cholesterol that can become problematic. The dyslipidemia, the high triglyceride levels can have an impact within stuff. The increased amount of saturated fats within the diet can have an impact on other types of metabolic issues. Or simply switching out the seed oils for a different plant-based fat, going from the seed oils that are the unsaturated, whether it's the poly or the monounsaturated, to the saturated avocado fat or the saturated coconut oil fat, doesn't necessarily make huge amounts of change in terms of the metabolic factors that come into play. Because once again, it's about the ratios of fats. It's not about the type of saturated fat, it's about the amount of saturated fat. It's not about it's not about all of the hysteria that comes into play when we say, oh, avoid saturated fats. It's about the ratios of saturated fats to unsaturated fats. And then within the unsaturated fats, it's the ratios of the omega-3s to the omega-6s. And what we want to make sure that we're doing is we're keeping those ratios intact. By keeping those ratios intact, we're able to make sure that we're not going to cause lipid-based issues in terms of triggering of inflammation. We're not going to give precursors to inflammatory markers. We're not going to cause changes of metabolic function, not cause changes of hormonal functions coming into play. That's going to lead to changes in overall health. And it goes back to what we talked about just a few minutes ago in terms of this idea about, is it the dietary stuff or is it the physical activity stuff? And once again, within that whole continuum of fitness and fatness, there's too many factors coming into play to specifically say, oh, well, it's simply because you're having too much unsaturated fat or you're having too much saturated fat to indicate that that is the only thing causing the issue. And that's why when we start looking at this idea about teaching the nutrition to physicians, teaching the nutrition to nurses, teaching the nutrition to other healthcare professionals, it's not about teaching nutrition. It's about integrating nutrition with metabolism, because we have to understand metabolism in order to understand nutrition, and we have to understand nutrition in order to understand metabolism. The other kind of core tenet that comes into play as relates to this idea about nutrition stuff causing metabolic disruptions, that is a core tenet within the MAHA idea, has to deal with the exposures to the herbicides and the pesticides in the industrial farming. While we have to accept the fact that exposure to the aerosolized chemicals, in particular the aerosolized glyphosates, can and does lead to increased risks for cancers, there is very limited evidence to support the claims that consuming foods that have been sprayed with the glyphosates lead to health issues. It's important to understand that many herbicides and pesticides can have impacts as a metabolic disruptor. That doesn't mean they're going to lead to cancers, and it doesn't lead to that they're going to lead to many of the other issues that the MAHA advocates keep voicing. And simply indicating that it is an artificial product in terms of the glyphosate, in terms of the herbicide and the pesticides, in terms of the organophosphates, in terms of the glyphosate, those factors, it doesn't matter whether it is artificial, it doesn't matter whether this is natural. The chemical natures themselves have been associated with increased oxidative stress, increased mitochondrial dysregulation, changes in enzymes within cells known as PPARs, increased accumulation of reactive oxidative species, alterations in amino acid metabolisms, in particular tyrosine and tryptophan, amino acids that are associated with neurotransmitter productions, which leads to changes in terms of cognitive functions, which leads to changes in responsiveness to hormones. Some include insulin and leptin, but that's just two of them. Changes in fat mass and adipocyte metabolism. But the other thing that a lot of the herbicides and pesticides do is that they mimic estrogen signaling, which causes an esterification of the body or a disruption in androgen or andrification signals within the body, which can cause disruptions in terms of reproductive functions. That doesn't mean that glyphosate and organophosphate, the two principal chemicals that we see within herbicides and pesticides, are going to automatically cause those things. It is a dose duration issue. It is not simply an exposure issue. And this is where we have to look at the incidence rates from individuals who are exposed to those chemicals through aerosolization versus those who are exposed through food products. And this idea about limiting those products falls in line with the dogmatic dietary practices expressed by the raw food advocates, by the organic advocates, by the vegan advocates that we wrote about in Dogmatic Diets. It's the argument that the use of the herbicides, in particular the use of the herbicide, the glyphosate, causes endocrine disruptions, alters gut microbe activity that triggers inflammation, that increases the relative risk of celiac issues, that increase the relative risk of irritable bowel issues, that increase the risk for selective cancers. The evidence doesn't support it in terms of the eating. The evidence supports it in terms of the aerosolized issues. The advice that the MAHA advocates and others will stipulate is, oh, well, simply just go ahead and eat organic. You're going to limit your exposure to the herbicides and the pesticides. No, you're simply going to limit your exposure to the quote unquote artificial herbicides and the quote unquote artificial pesticides. You're not going to limit your exposure to the herbicides and the pesticides. They're simply going to be a natural variant of those same chemicals. Additionally, the labeling organic is not an indication of anything. It's a marketing thing. Once again, it's not a scientific thing. It's not an indication that it is automatically going to be free of this, this, and this. It simply means that the farm itself checked off a certain number of boxes within the USDA's idea or the European Union's idea of what does it mean to farm organically. The most important thing we should point out, however, is that for people who are worried about exposure to those things, it's not about necessarily eating organic, simply washing the produce. Washing the produce will help eliminate a lot of the herbicides and pesticides and a lot of the other residues that might be on the produce that is being consumed without needing to worry about what does or what can those substances do as it relates to any type of endocrine disruption issues or metabolic disruption issues within the body. Once again, we have more on that topic, more on that idea within the Dogmatic Diets book. And I recommend go ahead and reading that or listening to those discussions that we had in terms of the dogmatic dietary practices. When we start looking at this idea about nutrition and health, we have to make sure that we're doing this under the guise of metabolism and understanding metabolism, understanding how metabolism is going to function as it relates to overall health. And this is where we have to get away from the biases that is being projected by the Health and Human Services ideas about diet and health, because they're talking about diet, they're not talking about nutrition. Diet is what I put into my mouth. It's what are the foods. Nutrition is what are the chemicals, what are the nutrients found in there. And that's where when we start looking at this idea about nutrition, We always have to go back to what is the foundation for what the nutrition is going to be, and that's my nutrient balance. And my nutrient balance is going to vary based off of all of the stresses that I have to myself, based off of all the things I'm doing on a regular basis. This is where we have to make sure we meet our minimum levels of stuff. Once again, the MAHA people and a lot of other people keep talking about sugar as being a boogeyman. But sugar's not a boogeyman. You need to have 120 to 140 grams of sugar each day simply so your neurons and your blood cells can function. You should be consuming sugars at a minimum of about 2 grams per kilogram of body mass, about a gram per pound, as long as you're meeting that minimum 120 grams per day. And this is where what people say, well, if I cut sugar out of my diet, I lose weight. Yeah, you lose weight. And the reason why you lose weight is because the body is going to take nutrients from where it's stored. You're going to break down body tissues in order to meet that nutrient balance requirement. It's not about calories. We've talked about that a lot. Even though everybody wants to talk about it in terms of calories, it's about my nutrient balance. But more importantly, as it relates to health, and this is the thing that is being missed in the discussion here, if we want to look at it in terms of health, we want to look at it in terms of correcting non-communicable diseases, then we have to look at it in terms of correcting anabolic dysregulation, which means while nutrition is a component of everything, the component that has a higher impact on reversal of non-communicable disease issues is exercise, structured physical activity. And this is where we have to go back to what we've talked about previously in terms of the self-motivated, self-selective lifestyle interventions and the advocacy that is being made and the advocacy that is usually trumpeted by people who say, oh, you have to be more active in order to become healthier, is aerobic endurance exercise. And that's fine if that's what you want to do. But if I'm not going to choose to want to do aerobic endurance exercise, I need to find other types of exercise to do. And we've talked about this a lot, and I recommend going back and listening to those discussions if you haven't listened to them previously, or go back to the YouTube channel and look at the discussion that we had in terms of periodization of exercise. That's there. The other thing that is missing within a lot of the discussion as relates to this idea about nutrition and metabolism as it relates to overall health, particularly within the ideas of MAHA, is the fact that diet, just like exercise, needs to be periodized so that we have a continuous ability to have adaptations taking place. Once again, going back to the idea of needing to balance nutrition with metabolism. Well, thanks for listening. Hope you got a bit out of the conversation here. Hopefully we didn't put you off in terms of pointing out some of the fallacies in some of the political stances that are being made by others. But once again, please remember, do not project the politics onto the science. Simply look at it in terms of the science being presented to you. Stay open-minded, stay intelligent in terms of that aspect. If you have questions or comments, please leave them for us. We're more than happy to address them in future discussions. Please stay tuned for future discussions as relates to some of the myths and misconceptions out there about how the human body works. If you're liking what we're putting out there, please make sure you give us that big 5-star rating. Give us that big thumbs up. Tell us that we're doing a good job. Make sure you have subscribed here on the podcast, as well as follow us on the YouTube channel, the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that we post to Instagram and onto Threads.